What does it feel like to be on the outside? Being labeled an outsider, whether it's at school or your workplace. Or what about in your local church? Maybe you've been labeled like that. This talk is about how to respond to that, and it will be part of 3 podcasts that we're doing. Welcome to De-Churched. John had been part of the church since his childhood. He got himself an undergraduate degree in an art subject and returned to his home church. As he tried to fit into church life again after university, he realized that he'd left college with a degree, but also a truckload of questions. And these questions weren't being answered by his local church. In fact, they were viewed with great suspicion. He felt on the outer. Most of the people were still kind, but the narrative and underlying culture of the community didn't provide a safe place to voice such questions and feelings that he had. The story being told from the front was one of certainty. It was binary in character, and that definitely didn't fit with where John was. He left the church because, like a lobster that has outgrown its shell, his questions had made him larger and unable to fit in constricted spaces. When you leave a faith community, you're also leaving a big story that you're part of. And if you're going to write a new story, it involves leaving the old, and that's painful. Humans define themselves with stories. When asked to describe ourselves, what do? We tell a series of tales about our life. This is me, is what we are saying. But our stories are not just about me, myself, and I. We're also part of larger stories, stories of family, of tribe, of nation. And those stories are also shaped by others. In my family, we have a series of stories from our children's lives that get wheeled out at special times. Funny stories, cute stories, meaningful stories. The retelling of them is a bonding exercise. And our sense of identity is tied to such stories, even our sense of worth and belonging. As an expat Brit, I am adopting and internalizing a new story, that of Australia. An ancient story with many strands to it. My passport says I'm Australian, part of my story, and I am part of it. I am one of a wave of new migrants over the last few decades. And this story is not controlled or defined entirely by me, but is also shared by all Aussies. One of the strongest stories that shapes our identity as humans, though, is our sense of place in the universe. If we see ourselves as part of a purposeful universe, one that has a goal, a designer, it helps to bring meaning to our lives and direction to our decision making. It gives us a sense of worth and identity. So what about the religious story? Maybe you've left a faith community and it's been painful for you. The story you were sold didn't fit anymore, but you still like Jesus. Why didn't the story fit? Was there something wrong with you? No. Perhaps the group you were with didn't make the story big enough, or wide enough, or inclusive enough. It tried to nail down truth in such a way that love became starved of oxygen. Love was drowned out by the clamor of truth claims. The guardians of the story, the church culture or tradition or the leaders, had some great things to say, of course, but you found yourself on the fringes of community life because your view, your journey, your life didn't quite fit in the center anymore. We are never fully in control of the big stories that define us. Others have power to redefine the story, and that can be negotiated or it can be forced upon us. So what happens to your shape or identity when that happens? What happens when the story is told in a restricted and sharply defined kind of way? Well, part of who we are is kind of broken off like losing a limb. For example, maybe you've been part of a faith community that says, this is how the story works. And if you stray outside our definition of it, you are an outsider. Now that may be said nicely and not with any apparent meanness, or it may just be implied. And the underlying message is this: this is the way we do things around here, the way we think, the way we view life and the world. And now you don't quite fit that narrative. And the result is you feel like you're not part of the story, and your sense of meaning and purpose and your very identity is under attack because you don't quite fit the box anymore. That can be very intimidating if that's the only religious story you know. I want to say this: the story is bigger and wider than we are sometimes told. And if those in power sustain the community by a neatly framed version of the story, it creates insiders and outsiders, members and non-members, the saved and the damned. It's not that there shouldn't be boundaries. Of course, we should value truth. However, and I think here is the part of the key, the truth we believe in is a person, not a scientifically precise formula. You cannot put me, Jules, into a linguistic format and sum me up and say, here is the creed of Jules. In the next 10 statements, you will be able to precisely describe who Jules is. No, truth is a person, and that makes our creeds just a little more tentative. It's good to have them, but it's always interesting to notice what they do and don't say. For example, in most of the church creeds, there is no mention of God's core nature as being love. Or again, no mention of Jesus' ministry to the poor and the outcast. In the creeds, it just seems like he was born, he died, and he rose again, and there's nothing in between. Of course, the creeds are meant to be summaries and have a specific purpose, but you kind of get what I'm saying. We cannot say everything about Jesus. Let me compare it to science. Science tries to capture levels of certainty, but even at its best, it's always an approximation. So Nobel physicist Richard Feynman said this about science: scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty, some most unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. Now, if that's true of science, how much more so of Jesus the person, or of God whom we have not seen? We need a little humility. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Jesus said, I am the truth. He embodies truth. And all our linguistic attempts to capture that are helpful, but not the whole story. When we say truth is a person, our boundaries become a little more porous and our definitions a little more tenuous. And we start to remember that we serve one whose arms were wide and who constantly pushed the boundaries, making them expand outwards. But if you have experienced the Christian story as one that didn't embrace you, it is painful. And to step out of the community is to step out of the story as it has been defined. And to step out of that story is to lose a key defining narrative of our lives. And that's what we call an existential crisis. In our next podcast, we're going to learn a new word. The phrase is othering. And we'll discover how Jesus describes the experience of the outsider and begin to look at fresh ways of viewing this. Don't forget to join us on our Facebook page and get involved in the discussion. But in these last few moments, let's just take a moment of quiet and stillness. Acknowledge the presence of the one who is quietly there in the midst of whatever you have experienced. This space is one of welcome. Let's keep traveling together as the De-Churched.